Okay, great. Hey, everybody. Welcome. Another episode of the Vectra AI Podcast. This one's a little different. I got a couple guests with me uh, in the quote unquote studio. Um, and this one's no slideware, nothing. We're just gonna have a conversation. We're just gonna talk about stuff because it's funny. We're in meetings quite a bit, and every time a lot of times when I'm in meetings, I'm like, we should have recorded this. This would have been a great podcast. So we're going to try and recreate that with two people. I'll let them introduce themselves. Why don't we start with you, Oliver?
Hi, Oliver Tavakoli. I'm the CTO at Vectra AI and have been here north of 11 years now, so pretty much for the entire journey.
Awesome.
And Sohrob Kazerounian, distinguished AI researcher here, also about 8 years now, so getting close
Wow.
to the decade mark. But yeah, been a bit.
God, I'm a baby. I'm a toddler. I've been here 2 years.
We call them
So
noob.
yeah, exactly. Well, yeah, thanks for jumping on. This will be an interesting conversation because I'm thinking like, a technologist, an AI researcher, and a product guy walk into a bar, and they start talking about something that's near and dear to my heart, attack signal intelligence. Those three words, right? And I wanted to pick both of your brains on that and get your perspectives on it because it was probably, if I look back, it was October of 2022. We introduced those three words into the market. And October 2022 seems like ages ago, right? And we know how fast this market moves. We know how fast things change. And I went back and I looked at our original definition of attack signal intelligence. Like, what is it? And in the press release, it says, automate threat detection, triage, and prioritization for SOC teams. And that was 18 months ago. And I think about all the stuff that we've been doing and seeing, and I'm like, is that really all it does? You know what I mean?
No.
Is that do it justice? I start thinking about things like, well, what's the difference between attack signal intelligence and threat intelligence? What's the difference? I have all these questions in my head, and we can kind of pick at them. But those three words, attack signal intelligence, like when you hear those, like what's your reaction? Like, take off the Vectra blinders. Like you hear attack signal intelligence. What does that mean? To an AI researcher, to a technologist, put yourself in the buyer's shoes, even a security practitioner's shoes. When they see those three words, what are we talking about? What does it exude?
Yeah, let me take kind of a top level crack. I mean, it's like when I put myself in the buyer's shoes, right? And I'm like, okay, intelligence, great. As you say, there's things like threat intelligence, which is, I would say, is intended to happen all the way upstream of you, right? You've got some organization that's watching threat actors and doing all this other kind of stuff, and then trying to distill that down to 1 or 2 or 5 or 10 IOCs that you can kind of trigger in your environment. I think when we talk about attack signal intelligence, we're really talking about something much more kind of bespoke to a particular customer's environment, particular organization's environment, right? It's this notion that I think we all kind of get that intrinsically, while most people prosecute threats, well, not even threats, alerts, an alert at a time. Why? Because it's easy to write a playbook that says, when this alert happens, do these 5 things, or when this alert happens, do these 12 things.
Mm-hmm.
But I think people also fundamentally understand, and this is kind of like where kind of the art and craft of a tier 3 analyst comes in, that it's really the combinations of those things that tell a story, the combinations of those things that, as they play out over time, that tell a fundamental story. And so intelligence for me is like this bespoke notion of kind of understanding a customer's environment and understanding, this permutation, this collection of particular signals at a given moment in time. How do we feel about it? And will it do the customer an undue amount of harm? And so for that to work, there's some basic building blocks of things that you have to do as a starting point. Even ignoring the intelligence, the precursor to the intelligence is you got to get your data house in order, right? To get your data house in order, you have to basically find what I just kind of described as really an incident, right? Like all of the behaviors collectively that really belong to one attack need to be somehow aggregated together. In order to do that, you need to begin by stitching the data, because it turns out that things like identity sounds like, okay, Woj, you have one identity, right, on the one hand, and yet how that manifests itself on the network, what it looks like on the network, what it looks like when you're in Active Directory, Azure AD, in a kind of SAML federated system, what it looks like when you're federated into an application or federated into a cloud. All of those things will name you in subtle ways differently.
Yeah.
All that stuff has to kind of like be stitched together. So everything that Woj does is like on one, is coalesced. And then it's like, great, if somebody's broken into Woj's account and then used that as a means of placing something onto a SharePoint that Oliver then clicked on, and now Oliver's machine got infected, and now Oliver's account got stolen as well. All of that is one incident. There's a series of behaviors that hopscotch, right? There are now three entities: my machine, Woj's identity, Oliver's identity, that all need to kind of coalesce into one thing before you can even stare at the thing and go, okay, what's the intelligence now? Intelligence is like actually grokking what that means and actually being able to do something with it, right?
Yeah, I think there's an interesting point here that that understanding, that sort of making sense of what that data means, both, taking what, is given to you in that information by way of the detection, but also coupling it with all of the background knowledge that a tier 3 analyst is bringing to bear when doing that investigation. And so actually, one of the things that I think is interesting, given that the attack signal intelligence framing came out a year and a half ago, is that maybe 2 years, 3 years back, really what we would have meant when we would talk about that would be like using an understanding of network traffic or cloud logs and so on to create more signal, right? So using machine intelligence, AI, deep learning, whatever techniques we had to create more signal about what's happening on your network. I think basically, given that the large language model revolution sort of blown up over the last year and a half, that framing has been pretty prescient, because now what we're shifting into is a regime where basically what you can do is bring all of that sort of background world knowledge to bear when doing an investigation, when deciding, are these things actually related? Is there a user that is behind these two accounts that's actually not necessarily related to you in that data, as a first order sort of construct, but has to get you to use background knowledge to make that inference or connection. And so in that sense, the attack signal intelligence has evolved to mean that sort of deeper understanding, contextualization, to basically really make sense of, whether or not there's an attack, whether or not it's malicious, whether or not, there's going to be a serious impact there.
Yeah, I think you guys just what I heard from like both of you as you're kind of explaining your interpretation of those three words. It's almost like they're in the reversed order, right? In order to, you first have to have intelligence, right? In order to arrive at signal, right? To derive whether or not this is a real attack.
Yeah.
Right?
And then
basically,
intelligence at the beginning and intelligence at the end, right?
Yeah.
Intelligence to get the signal, and then
yeah.
once you've got the signal, intelligence to make sense of it, right? And
to interpret the collection of signal, right? And again, I think the other thing that is kind of prescient in terms of, like, if you think of the LLM revolution, right? You can look at an LLM and say, well, it outperforms, I don't know, 84% of PhD students, in a particular field. And it's like, okay, great. So it's a better than average PhD candidate. But part of the problem that we're dealing with is the fact that, and this is where now we can kind of project across to XDR, right? In the world of XDR, what we're really talking about is that these signals, which may require a degree of intelligence themselves to extract, But then these signals each operate in their own independent domains that are incredibly complex and are totally different. So if you understand AWS and the underlying configuration structures and the underlying threat models and the way an attacker would work their way through AWS, it helps you hardly any with if you were to look at GC. These systems are constructed very differently. They have their own independent mental models. And so if you look at endpoint, if you look at identity, if you look at these different cloud systems, if you look at network, the notion that a modern tier 3 analyst is dealing with a collection of threats. Again, we've said dealing with threats individually, dealing with signals individually doesn't really get you there. So you're dealing with this collection of threats. Each of them require you to be kind of, a PhD candidate in one of those fields. And so it strains credulity that even one person trying to investigate that collection can do so because of the breadth of knowledge that it requires. And yet an LLM, which is a single thing, relatively speaking, a single thing, right, can be PhD candidate at 100 different things.
Yeah.
And so this is where the serendipity of kind of the LLMs coming along in this window in time actually allows us to also imagine tackling the next order problem, which is not just here is this collection of signal, and this is why we think it's threatening, but to actually be able to rationally think about automating the investigative process underlying it without relying, as SOARs and other techniques like that have done in the past, of a whole bunch of playbooks being written by humans. In other words, like humans automating machine processes will still always be a bar. This is why SIMs and SOARs have struggled over the years to gain traction, because not only do you have to create that automation, then you have to maintain that automation because it will break, right? And so you can now imagine a system whereby really with a small amount of nudges by human beings, right, for things that the machine can't necessarily divine. What keeps you up at night, right? Oh, that's my manufacturing area. I care about business continuity there. Oh, that's my PCI enclave. I care about data exfiltration there. These are things that are kind of like in the heads of people working in the organization that machines cannot necessarily divine about environments.
Yeah.
But with a handful of nudges, you can imagine a system now that will actually kind of prosecute, not only find the signal, stitch it together, aggregate it to an incident, but then we'll go prosecute that incident, right? And actually go do the investigation and present the entirety of the investigation out to the customer. And the other kind of interesting thing at that point becomes what we think of as signal today, right, can in some senses be substituted by investigative process, right? So as an example, if you found enough of the attack quickly, but you didn't find the C2, but then as part of the investigation, you could go find the C2, that's in some senses no different to the customer than if you found the C2 and then found the rest of the investigation. The end result is still you have a complete box set of information that tells you kind of what the blast radius of the attack is. And so I think this is the other kind of part of intelligence, is that you have the degree of flexibility of substitution of how you tackle problems. And human intuition tends to not just know one way to solve a problem, but to actually figure out the easiest way to solve that problem, right?
Yeah.
Rather than it's like, hey, the back door of this building is open. Well, let me try a battering ram at the front door is not exactly, the the best approach, right?
Right.
There's when you talk to analysts who are using our platform, for example, they'll go out and extract information from places like LinkedIn to make a determination or judgment about, okay, is this user accessing that service? Is it actually weird, or are they part of that business unit? And those are the kinds of pieces of information that it's really difficult to automate pulling in and operationalizing, right? And so, I think with my background in AI, my perspective has always been like LLMs sort of make that world of end-to-end automation possible. And I think the interesting thing is, in conversations with Oliver and others, you realize that actually it's XDR that makes that kind of automation absolutely necessary, Right? Like to Oliver's point, you're not going to get an individual who's both your cloud detection expert and your network traffic expert and also your identity expert, and he's going to be just prosecuting the end-to-end investigation perfectly or whatever. Um, by virtue of the fact that we have to aggregate and stitch and collect all of this information from all these domains, that's where that kind of automation becomes necessary.
Yeah, it's almost like attack signal intelligence has come full circle here. So the way you guys are talking about it, 18 months ago, as the product guy out there marketing this thing, right? I'm like, hey, we're gonna help you by delivering, an actionable, accurate signal. We're gonna prioritize. We're gonna do that. But the evolution of attack signal intelligence, oh, we're also going to give you the intelligence to understand and assess and validate whether this attack is a real thing that I need. Should I care about this? You're also going to have the intelligence to be able to investigate it extremely fast, right? Effectively. And then obviously an intelligence from a response perspective. What action should I take? So it's almost like attack signal intelligence runs the whole gamut. And with the acceleration of LLMs and Gen AI, we often talk about what you guys were describing, the experience of the SOC analysts and like some of the things that they have to do to go out and collect additional intelligence or data. To me, it screams latency. Like there's all kinds of latency in that process. Um, Oliver, you referred to it as like
Yeah,
little nudges here and there,
yeah.
right? The human's always going to be involved, right? But where, and this is what I've been racking my brain on, is like at the end of the day, what does the SOC, what do they ultimately want, or any security organization or any organization at large, is like, hey, we gotta reduce exposure to attack. Now, you see that in posture and you see that, but exposure exists post-compromise too. So I would argue you need to reduce exposure post-compromise. They want to remove latency from their systems or their processes or their people, right? And then they
There's also like
ultimately,
there's also like just the variability, right? I mean, you've got a
yeah,
bunch of analysts, right? They're like none of them are perfect, right? And what you're looking for is kind of like this amalgam of as many of the best practices as possible.
right.
And if a particular analyst has an off day, if a particular analyst doesn't know something, right, you don't want the variability as a business of it's like, well, who did we assign this problem to? Oh, that's
Right,
where we screwed it up, right? We
right,
assigned this to the
right,
wrong person who happened not to have expertise in the area that ended up being the important thing to have expertise in for this thing, right?
right.
Which was unknowable at the front edge of the problem when we assigned it, right?
Yeah, and that's the third pillar. That's the
Yeah,
whole, how do you maximize your existing time and talent, right? In
yeah.
terms of like, and that's where attack signal intelligence, AI, LLMs, they all play a role in that. So it's like reduce exposure, remove latency, maximize your talent. There's kind of the value pillars, I would say, of
Mhm.
attack signal intelligence, but it is full circle, which brings me to another question I wanted to pick both of your brains on. Um, you talked about humans, and when you think about the humans, and we've said SOC analyst, um, like beyond the SOC analyst, is there anyone else in the security organization that attack signal intelligence helps remove latency? I have a theory, but I wanted to, and I don't want to feed the witness. So like whatever in terms of like who else benefits from
I think
this?
I think along the way of solving the class of problems that we're talking about, right? The system gains an innate understanding not just of how to interpret activity that it sees in the system and to judge whether it's potentially going to do you a lot of harm, but to just form a lot of information and intuitions about how the system operates, and also quite frankly how vulnerable it is then as a result of that to certain kinds of things. And so I think the natural thing that comes out of a system like this is also the ability to probably provide some pretty impressive, hey, if there are 5 things you might want to do before the attack occur, what are the 5 things that are going to have the maximal effect? So now you're talking really more posture, but not in the classic posture
Yeah.
sense, which is like patch management and config management, but in the sense of understanding the environment to a sufficient degree, understanding attacks to a sufficient degree, to basically say, hey, here are the high value things that you ought to be doing. And so I think that naturally kind of also brings it to a different audience, because obviously those are, any information that has to do with kind of that kind of hardening goes more to architecture and engineering and other parts of the business that are really trying to do things ahead of time. The other thing I would say to you is, with identity as being such an important pivot these days, there's no way you're not going to be dealing with the identity and access management team, right? And again, there's a notion of, okay, things that you could do that are more preventive and that reduce attack surface and reduce blast radius and elongate attack chains that need to occur. So I think there's a way of kind of reaching out to a number of different kind of constituencies, even at that level.
Yeah.
I think almost in a generic sense, by virtue of making your data understandable, interpretable, by applying sort of these techniques in order to make it actionable, you make it very easy to answer a variety of questions, right? So like, where, like the point Oliver's making about, where the top 5 cuts I would make if I had to, best secure my environment. This is not just a question that's relevant for posture, but as you're detecting, investigating an attack, you're going to have to make you're going to have to combine the knowledge you have about the environment in order to best understand what likely was the case in the thing that you're investigating, right? And so both on the, what do I clean up? What's my inventory of stuff? What are my access policies? To even on the end of that, reading it out to various teams, right? Being able to make that information actionable in different ways. So what's the cost of, this potential attack? How do I, explain what these detections are to my C-suite? Like, organized and sort of understood properly, that data, that information becomes actionable in whole new ways.
Yeah. I mean, we were talking about, I just lost my train of thought because you touched on something that, because there was a follow on that I wanted to give you guys in terms of like, the person or the group that, and I've been doing some poking around. I just go to LinkedIn and I look at like, hey, show me all the open job recs for SOC analyst or security analyst, various titles, and it shoots me a number. Oh, there's like 3,000 something in the US or whatever. And then I looked up the role and I wanted to pick your guys' brains on this with knowing what we, believe attack signal intelligence to be. The poor detection engineer. There are actually more open job recs for detection engineers than there are for SOC analysts. And the product guy in me or the marketing guy in me thinks, why? Why are there more open jobs for detection engineers? And I think it's because you just described what you described on the onset, Oliver, is like, you've got to find expertise in certain domains. You've got to stitch stuff together. You've got to, what is it about this role that is,
I think I think of it slightly differently. I think people are overwhelmed with dealing with trying to make sense out of the existing signal that they have. And so there's a sense of, hey, what if we just, this signal that we're getting is so bad because it is not attuned to us. And so if in lieu of that, if we just wrote our own detections that were incredibly attuned to our environment, right, we would start with a purer signal, and then the problem wouldn't be so horrible at the top end of the stack. And so I think there's this notion that, solving a problem in a generic way that works for many customers is inherently difficult and is likely to generate noise. Solving it in a custom way for myself is more tractable. I think the problem is that we've seen organizations kind of go through this in the past. Again, it was at the margins. It wasn't necessarily a central motif to how some large organizations are looking at the problem. And what we tended to see are some successes for a window in time that proved ultimately unsustainable, because you now not only, like, creating the first set of detections adrenaline rush. We're making the world a better place,
Yeah.
right?
Yep.
And then you kind of get a year in, and now you have, okay, well, we've got these, 125 detections we've already written that are in various states of repair and disrepair because the environment has changed and the data has changed, and so now we got to go fix those. At the same time, we've got these new threat models that we have to be attuned to, that we got to go build for. And so I think that is what you're seeing, but it is effectively just it is a reaction to the problem at the top. And we
Yep.
would argue that, yeah, you need good signal. You certainly need good and early signal of an attack, because the earlier you get and the cleaner you get at least a signal to start an investigation, right? The better the chance that you quickly adjudicate it before it does you a lot of harm. But I do think that ultimately, trying to create custom detections in all these different environments and trying to perfect those things is not a sustainable model. I think it is an in vogue thing right now, and I think it works at the margins where you have some very highly specialized requirements, but as a base model for how you're going to operate. Imagine every customer, every company needing to understand every threat model from every APT group and every threat actor, right? And then juxtapose that against their environment and what it is they need. And so, yeah, they can create unique stuff. It's very hard for them to kind of create the full tier of signal that they would need.
Yeah.
It reminds me of a joke that I'm going to describe rather than tell, because I'm worried I won't be able to deliver well. But the joke about a drunk guy walking down the street, drops his keys, loses them, and he's looking at, by the lamppost, and cop comes over and says, "Hey, what's going on? What did you lose?" "I dropped my keys." Cop says basically, like, "Is this where you lost them?" The guy says, "No, it's, I dropped it somewhere over there." And the cop says, "Well, why are you looking over here?" It's like, "Well, this is where the light is." Right. And so
Dude,
I think a lot
if you were going to go for that one, you should have at least gone for like the moth joke by Norm Macdonald, which is
yeah. If you guys had 15 minutes and I was able to deliver that, but I think the reason a lot of people are probably looking for detection engineers is that they think, hey, this is, all we can do. Like, let's go get more of these people, create more of the signal. Let's shine the light, more and more over here. But I think as people start to, experience with more detection engineers, you have more signal, but that doesn't necessarily on its own help you do anything with it.
Yeah.
You have to make it actionable. You have to try and understand what that information means, especially in the context of your environment. And so I think ultimately it's going to be, there will be a shift away from that.
Basically those teams are trying to lessen the load on their SOC, right? And they're like, well, if you go upstream, maybe we can make this problem easier. The one other topic that I would like to kind of bring up that you kind of touched upon, that I'm going to be a little bit contrarian on, is you said, well, the humans will always be in the loop, right? And I think there's always a spectrum, right? If you think about when malware sandboxing came around, right? This notion that you had some automated machinery, right, that would basically go run the malware in a sandbox and declare it evil, and then would add a rule into, say, the firewall and say, block this henceforth. That's a fully automated action, right?
Yeah.
You're basically running some analytics, and as a result of that analytics, creating some bespoke threat intel for yourself. So there's always been this notion, when it seems trustable and repeatable enough, the notion that you just take the human out of the loop rather than, hey, should we put this rule into the firewall, right? So, and I think similar things will happen here. First of all, the thing to make clear that what we're talking about, a lot of the models right now around Gen AI and cybersecurity are like these co-pilot models, right? Which is kind of like augmented reality, right? It's like the analyst has a set of goggles on, they're looking at the universe, and the co-pilot model is saying, hey, there's a bad guy hiding behind this boulder, and by the way, you could get attacked from over yonder, right? So it's basically, but if you're not looking there, nothing is happening, right? We're really talking about a model that ultimately has to operate autonomously, right? It's like another analyst on your team that happens to be, as I said, like PhD level at all these different areas, right? Doing work and communicating with you. And minimally what that person, that AI analyst will require are these nudges, right? And over time, it will prove itself trustworthy enough in its recommendations that you will, with guardrails, say, yeah, just automate that action. Just take that action when you see it. And you will take more and more of the ambiguous stuff and kind of limit yourself to having to look at, okay, here was the signal, here was the investigation, here's the recommendation. Do I agree with this? This is outside the guardrails, right? And so I think there's a spectrum here. I think we tend to freak out and tend to go, all hell 9000 usually whenever you talk about automation of machinery. But there are tons of examples, and it's just that when they don't seem magical enough, we discount them as having cut the human out of the loop. But there's plenty of examples where humans are cut out of the loop in cybersecurity today.
The demystification that basically, it gets dethroned as being, it's not actually intelligent. That's just the system.
It just works, Once it works predictably, it is no longer intelligent.
It becomes dumb.
That is a definition of the human condition. It's only if it feels like it has some pixie dust in it that it can be considered intelligent. And yet, the funny thing is, there's also the human inclination to then ask you, well, how does it work, and what does it do, and how does it work? And then when you explain it all to them, if it's fully explainable, it's no longer intelligent. And if it's not explainable, then, well, what is it? Then how can I ever trust it? And so that is the weirdness about the word intelligence in general.
Yeah. I mean, we could go on for another hour, because now you guys are just feeding me all kinds of questions and topics. But I think we'll do another one of these
sure,
in the next couple of weeks or so, because I'm gonna whet your appetite with a question to think about, because I've been thinking about this, because you brought it up quite a bit around the word signal and obviously intelligence and whatnot. And we had talked to the guys at SANS about this as well. It's like the industry has an infatuation with purchasing detections. Like, I need detection coverage, right? Who has more detections? Thus, they have better coverage or better signal. And I would argue, based on this conversation, I'm hearing you don't need to detect everything. You just need to have the right data and do the right correlations to arrive at intelligence, to have intelligence, and then to have signal. So I'm going to plug your brain on this whole notion of coverage, detection coverage, and buying detections, and who has better detections. And it's like, because ultimately when we introduced attack signal intelligence, it was like, hey, it's no longer about threat detection, it's about attack signal. It's no longer, can you detect this threat? It's now, do you have actionable attack signal? Is this a real attack? Is this worth your time and talent, et cetera, et cetera? And can you stop it, investigate and stop it as quickly as possible? Whether it's the human or it's the future state, Oliver, of the automation
that'll certainly be a
ultimately come.
Good conversation. Unsurprisingly, we'll have opinions on that.
It's taking so much self-control not to talk about it now.
Well, exactly. Well, yeah, we will do it sooner rather than later while it's fresh. So awesome. Thanks, guys. This was great. This was fantastic. And everybody, thanks for tuning in. Oliver, Sohrob, we'll pull you guys back in another week or so.
Cool.
Awesome.
Yeah,
Thanks, guys.
Pleasure.
All right. Take care.
You.